On December 10th, 1906, the President of the United States of America was awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace. Theodore Roosevelt was the first head of state to receive the award, and there were many people who thought he did not deserve it. One newspaper in Sweden wrote that Alfred Nobel would be spinning in his grave over the award. Theodore Roosevelt's Nobel Peace Prize was symbolic of a world in change. It perhaps typified the complex legacy of the nation's 26th president, and it was perhaps an unavoidable consequence of the sorts of controversies that will arise when you give an award for peace in a world where reality means that peace is uncommon at best. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Alfred Nobel came from a prominent Swedish family, although he spent much of his youth in St. Petersburg, Russia. His father relocated there and built a successful business manufacturing machine tools and explosives for construction. Alfred was able to study with fine tutors, although he had very little formal schooling and did not attend university. A gifted chemist, his most famous and profitable inventions were related to explosives, notably dynamite, but also gelignite and balisite, all essentially more stable forms of nitroglycerin. These inventions, as well as successful investing, made Nobel, as Smithsonian Magazine put it, ridiculously wealthy. The story behind the prizes that bear his name is steeped in legend. The most common story is that a French newspaper had mistakenly written an obituary for him in 1888 when his brother Ludwig died. In the obituary, the paper wrote, Le marchand de la mort est mort, meaning the merchant of death is dead, reference to his development of explosives used in war. Appalled that that would be his legacy, he decided to use his estate to leave a better one. But there are holes in the story. The Smithsonian notes not only has this erroneous obituary not been identified, but the supposed paper on which it was printed basically doesn't exist except attached to this tale. Even if the story was true, and there is reason to question it, it's not likely to have been the sole motivator it's implied to be. In 2014, Annika Ponticus, public relations manager for the Nobel Foundation, told editors at Legacy.com that yes, Nobel saw his obituary in advance, and yes, he was unhappy about what he read. Still, it was probably not the only factor that influenced him to create a Peace Prize. Nobel himself seems to have left no specific description of his reasoning, nor left a written record of the story of the obituary in his own hand. It's not mentioned on the Nobel Prize website, which says simply, Alfred Nobel had a vision of a better world. He believed that people were capable of helping to improve society through knowledge, science, and humanism. What is documented is that he signed a last will and testament on November 27, 1895, in which he left more than 90% of his ridiculous wealth, about 31.5 million Swedish crowns, to be invested in safe securities and should constitute a fund, the interest on which shall be annually distributed in the form of prizes to those who, during the preceding year, shall have conferred the greatest benefit on mankind. Nobel stipulated that prizes should be created for physics, chemistry, medicine or physiology, literature, and peace. The Peace Prize, according to the will, should be awarded to the person who shall have done the most or the best work for fraternity between the nations in abolition or reduction of standing armies and the formation and spreading of peace congresses, to be awarded by a committee of 5 persons, to be elected by the Norwegian Storting, its legislature. Nobel added, It is my express wish that when awarding the prizes, no consideration be given to nationality, but that the prize be awarded to the worthiest person, whether or not they are Scandinavian. Nobel died on December 10, 1896, but the prizes were not awarded right away. The Nobel Institute explains that Nobel's will resulted in lawsuits in Sweden, and prizes could not be awarded until those were resolved. The first Nobel Peace Prize was awarded in 1901 and was shared by Swiss humanitarian Henri Dunant, founder of the International Red Cross movement and who had initiated the Geneva Convention, and Frederick Passy, who had founded multiple peace societies. Theodore Roosevelt became President of the United States on September 14, 1901, following the death of William McKinley. As a president, Sidney Millikus of the University of Virginia Miller Center explains, TR's diplomatic maxim was to speak softly and carry a big stick, and he maintained that a chief executive must be willing to use force when necessary while practicing the art of persuasion. The Naval Institute Press writes that Roosevelt promoted peace with other nations via deterrence, which required keeping our Navy so strong that war may not come, or that we may be successful if it does come. His efforts transformed the United States from a middling power with a toothless navy to a great power with the world's second most powerful navy. He modernized the National Guard, better integrated it into the Army, and defined the Marine Corps as an overseas expeditionary force. While Roosevelt couched all of his actions as serving the ultimate goal of peace, Milikis writes that he believed that the exportation of American values and ideals would have an ennobling effect upon the world. He certainly saw the role as peacemaker differently than, for example, Baroness Bertha von Suttner, awarded the 1905 Nobel Prize for Peace, an Austrian noblewoman and pacifist so committed to her opposition of militarism that she was called Generalissimo of the peace movement. Suttner famously said, "Strange how blind people are. They're horrified by the torture chambers of the Middle Ages, but their arsenals fill them with pride." Among her arguments was disarmament as a path to world peace. This was, needless to say, a different perspective than Roosevelt's. Smithsonian writes, although he may have believed in peace, he was hardly a pacifist. And thus the international surprise when Roosevelt received the Nobel Prize the next year, in 1906. The Russo-Japanese War broke out in 1904, the product of a collision of empires. Both the traditional power of Russia and the growing power of Japan were busy developing spheres of influence in Asia and preying on the eroding power of the Chinese Qing dynasty. The resulting competition seemed destined to turn into conflict, as Russian ambitions in Manchuria started to press against Japanese ambitions in Korea. A particular bone of contention was Port Arthur on the Liaodong Peninsula. Russia had coerced a lease from the Chinese for the fortified harbor, giving them a warm water port on the Pacific, but the Japanese saw the port as a threat to their strategic interests. The Office of the Historian of the United States Department of State writes, a Japanese attempt to stage a coup in adjacent Korea was thwarted in part by the Russian presence in the region, and the two nations' divergent interests appeared more and more likely to clash. Benjamin Minardi of George Mason University explained in 2020, unable to reach an agreeable status quo while neglecting to fully indicate its resolve on the issue of Korea, Japan prepared for conflict. In February 1904, breaching international etiquette established by the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a surprise strike against the Russian Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur prior to officially declaring war. The resulting contest for domination of East Asia would become the first major armed conflict of the 20th century. Some, in fact, see the Russo-Japanese War as the prelude to the Great Wars of the 20th century, calling it World War Zero. The conflict introduced new technologies, represented one of the first contests of modern battleships. National Arbitration and Mediation notes Russia's European allies, as well as Japan's allies, risked being drawn into the conflict. Despite the efforts at international peace represented by the recipients of the Nobel Prize, the world was already on the brink of war at the outset of the 20th century. But the conflict was costly to both sides, as National Arbitration and Mediation writes. Although vastly outmatched, Japan dealt Russia a series of humiliating military losses on land and at sea. Russian Tsar Nicholas II was on the verge of complete military defeat. Japan, however, was running out of troops and ammunition. The cost of waging war were pushing both combatants to the brink of bankruptcy. The solution, surprisingly, came from the man who famously wielded a big stick. Theodore Roosevelt watched the war with interest. America was traditionally isolationist, but Roosevelt believed we could no longer afford to be. In a famous speech in 1899, he said, "We cannot sit huddled within our own borders and avow ourselves merely an assemblage of well-to-do hucksters who care nothing for what happens beyond." He had attempted to mediate a solution before the outset of war and maintain diplomatic contacts throughout. Moreover, he saw an opportunity to end the war. He explained in his autobiography, "The losses of life and treasure were frightful. I grew most strongly to believe that a further continuation of the struggle would be a very bad thing for Japan, and an even worse thing for Russia. Japan was already suffering terribly and had nothing further to gain from continuance of the struggle. Its continuation meant more loss than gain. Russia, in spite of her gigantic strength, was, in my judgment, apt to lose even more than she had already lost if the struggle continued. I believe, therefore, that the time had come when it was greatly to the interest of both combatants to have peace, and when, therefore, it was possible to get both to agree to peace." It wasn't an easy task, with both parties reticent, until Japan worried on their losses, more than 88,000 casualties at the February 1905 Battle of Mudkin. The Tsar, believing that God was on his side, was even more reticent, despite a string of Japanese victories. Then his fleet was decisively defeated, mostly sunk, in the May 1905 Battle of Tsushima. Roosevelt's time had come. National Arbitration and Mediation writes, both sides wished to negotiate peace, but feared losing honor by being the first to request peace talks. Volunteering himself, Roosevelt publicly requested that both sides meet, thus allowing Japan and Russia to save face. Japan and Russia agreed, and the United States agreed to act as host, raising America's world stature. The Treaty for Peace was negotiated in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and signed on September 5th. Edward Cohn of Norwich University writes, "The resulting Portsmouth Treaty brought an end to the war. but at some cost to the United States. Neither the Japanese nor Russians were happy with the resulting compromise. But if there was a winner, it was Theodore Roosevelt, Smithsonian writes. Roosevelt was inundated with letters of congratulation at his Long Island home in Sagamore Hill until the official staff of clerks were overwhelmed by the task of answering them. The French newspaper Le Matin writes, Roosevelt is the victor. The Glenville, Minnesota Progress reported, all the world seemed to be sending one unending message of gratitude and commendation to President Roosevelt yesterday, in which the glory of the conclusion of the peace was given from many lands, in many languages, and from admirers in every walk of life. Among those to notice was the Norwegian Peace Prize Committee. On December 10, 1906, Theodore Roosevelt became the first American to receive any Nobel Award and the first statesman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. The presentation was presided over by Gunnar Knudsen, a member of the Storting and future Prime Minister of Norway, who said, what has especially directed the attention of the Friends of Peace in the civilized world is President Roosevelt's happy role in bringing to an end the bloody war recently waged between two of the world's great powers, Japan and Russia. Roosevelt was not there for the speech. The Theodore Roosevelt Center explains, unable to be in Norway to collect the prize at the time, Roosevelt asked the United States ambassador to Norway, Herbert H.D. Pierce, to accept the award on his behalf. He would not arrive in Norway to give his acceptance speech until he was on a tour of Europe in 1910. But not everyone was pleased. In the brief list of those who had been awarded the prize, Roosevelt was the winner of the game of one of these things is not like the other. The Nobel Prize website reads, for the first time, the award was controversial. The Norwegian left argued that Roosevelt was a military-mad imperialist who completed the American conquest of the Philippines. Swedish newspapers wrote that Alfred Nobel would be turning in his grave. Even the committee seemed to be less than infatuated with him. The advisor who wrote the report about the president presented to the committee gave the decidedly backhanded compliment. It is obvious that even if a statesman himself has no faith in the cause of peace, he still may make great contributions to it. There was even dubiousness at home. The New York Times wrote, a broad smile illuminated the face of the globe when the prize was awarded to the most warlike citizen of these United States. Perhaps most scandalous was an assumption about the committee's motives. Sweden and Norway had been combined as a personal union in 1814, a partnership in which Norway had been the subordinate partner in the combined state. Norwegian nationalism had risen in the 19th century, and in August 1905, a national plebiscite in Norway had overwhelmingly supported dissolving the Union. Of some 370,000 votes cast, only 184 people voted against dissolution. The Union was officially dissolved on October 26th, the Nobel Prize Committee explains. From the meeting of the Norwegian Storting on 7 June 1905, in which it declared the Union with Sweden dissolved as a result of the king ceasing to function as the Norwegian king, after partial military mobilization in both countries, a peaceful settlement was reached later that year, and Norway became fully independent. On 10 December 1906, the Nobel Peace Prize to President Theodore Roosevelt was presented in the same hall. Thus, a criticism arose. Had Norway awarded the Peace Prize to Roosevelt in order to win powerful friends after the dramatic dissolution of the Union with Sweden the previous year? The Swedish newspaper Social-Demokraten opined that the committee simply thought that Norway needed a large, friendly neighbor, even if he is far away. But was the criticism fair? The Nobel Prize website writes, still it seems reasonable to assume that the members of the Nobel Committee actually considered Roosevelt a worthy candidate. Furthermore, with due respect for the pioneers of the non-governmental peace movement, the committee may have been determined to use the prize as a tribute to one of those who were really able to get things done in the struggle for peace. In fact, the president had been more than some militaristic opportunist seeking to benefit from the movement. Cohn writes, Roosevelt personally intervened in the negotiations to bring an end to the Russo-Japanese War, including direct appeals to the Russian Tsar and his fellow monarch, the German Kaiser. Moreover, one of the major sticking points of the negotiations was the issue of indemnity. Japan felt that they had won the war and felt entitled to receive an indemnity from Russia for ending it. The Office of the State Department historian explains the indemnity issue was a major sticking point in the negotiation, although, given its financial straits in 1905, Russia was likely unable to pay any indemnity even if it was required by the treaty to do so. Here, Roosevelt showed his mediation skills. National Arbitration and Mediation rights through separate meetings at Oyster Bay with members of each delegation, the first breakout rooms. Roosevelt improvised and made recommendations for alternative solutions. Roosevelt also made extensive use of his back-channel network of mutual connections to persuade the leaders of each country. Cohn writes, Working through fellow Harvard alumnus Baron Kaneko, Roosevelt also warned the Japanese delegation that international opinion would turn against Japan if the war continued only because of Japan's demand for a huge cash indemnity. Perhaps the historian of the United States State Department put it best when he says that the actual importance of Roosevelt's mediation and personal pressure upon the leadership in Moscow and Tokyo upon the final agreement is unclear. And that's perhaps fitting to the complex legacy of Theodore Roosevelt, a man of peace and a man of war, indicative perhaps of where our nation sat in that dynamic era. The Theodore Roosevelt Center notes that Roosevelt did not keep the $40,000 in prize money. Instead, he donated it to Congress in order to create an industrial peace committee that was supposed to deal with fair dealings between all classes of society. But Congress never created the committee, so he petitioned to get the funds back and distributed them as relief during the First World War. And there is one last note to make about war and peace. Cohn notes that the agreement left Japan as the preeminent power in the Far East, with footholds in both Korea and Manchuria. Thus, he writes, the road to Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 might have begun in Portsmouth, New Hampshire in August of 1905. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop, book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.